The way you might think about taste is as a faculty of judgment that's been refined through a course of mature experience. So that someone has, through the course of their life, developed a habit of being able to render judgment on something. And so that you are able to trust it when they say this thing is going to be cool or not cool or whatever. They know something about it before it actually happens. That's what it means to have taste, is the ability to select from like a host of options what will happen. And so when we talk about taste, it's not just about having versus not having, right? You don't need taste if I have a car and you don't, right? Taste is irrelevant because I simply have the thing. But if we both have cars, it's quite a bit more relevant that I have a Ferrari. But the way that that comes about is through some sort of abundance. That means we need to select from the abundance, and we need a kind of development of a faculty that allows us to select. And so our whole thesis about the artist founder is looking for people who have spent their entire lives basically developing that faculty. And then the thesis is that those people at the present moment have the exact skill set that's necessary and that's at an increasing premium. People who have spent years identifying what in human relations or human technical relations really stands out. Like, what do people want to participate in? When you get the e-commerce revolution, the question isn't like, what are the human relations? What's the friction that we want to preserve? It's exactly the opposite. But now that that SaaS revolution has happened and we're in the agentic revolution, the question is increasingly, what are the forms of friction that we want to preserve? And what are the new economic categories that will be created around them? So this class of person has always been someone who identifies the highest value friction. We actually are not yet in a place where we can have a sovereign decision, because the only decision seemingly available is refuse or let it rip. And it's what we're all sort of sensing, so that you have this forced choice of like, I'm in or I'm out. And that kind of feels horrible. And so in order to develop the capacities to have this sovereign choice over what future one wants to inhabit, we do need the development of different sensory capacities that give us more options.
Welcome to episode 37 of Humans on the Loop. Today we're exploring how to make the most of a profound categorical shift. AI is rapidly receding into the background of the human environment, transforming into an omnipresent infrastructure that layers intelligence across every aspect of our physical and digital realities, and a non-specific amplifier of human intention. And that's a serious constraint. Despite the radical nature of this evolution, our current deployment of new technology remains surprisingly uninspired. Or maybe not so surprisingly. Trapped within a narrow commercial paradigm, the tech sector continuously optimizes existing tasks like proofreading emails, while failing to discover the genuinely novel forms of human experience that this intelligent substrate makes possible. Or as William Morgan of Restless Egg puts it, why does everything in the near future either want to kill you or get you off? Using our new superpowers to merely do what we already do but better makes us passive consumers of desires and selves imposed by the technopoly. If we are to avoid sleepwalking into a future defined entirely by market forces, we need to cultivate the taste and discernment to know which futures are worth living in and radically expand our imagination regarding what human-machine relationships could actually look like. William is today's guest, and he's committed to just that. He's the co-founder of Restless Egg, a London-based incubator and accelerator designed specifically for a new class of artist founders whose work synthesizes art, technology, and commercial product design. He holds a PhD on the philosophy of AI from UC Berkeley, where his work explored the deep conceptual and socio-political frameworks of computation. This background directly informed his trajectory as a researcher on critical initiatives with organizations like Antikythera, where he co-developed research tracks exploring complex macro-scale informational and cognitive systems. With Restless Egg, Morgan has moved decisively from theory to practice, promoting a new avant-garde who recognize their obligation to participate in the unfolding relationship between technology and culture. As he writes in one of the articles we discuss in this episode, one unignorable conclusion about the AI revolution is that from now on, everything one does is training data. Furthermore, everything one might want to do is theoretically more possible now than ever before through additional compute, or so they say. At the same time, even those building AI and frontier labs don't know the full extent of what these machines can do, much less what they should be doing. Thus, the question becomes, why is it this way and not that? As players in this, the rigorous game of living, it is your job, your responsibility, your opportunity to design what might fill in the blank before it is filled in for us. End quote. Right now, maybe nothing is more important than to nurture novel forms of interactability that expand rather than restrict what it means to be human, which is precisely what Restless Egg is up to, and incidentally, what we're doing at Atlas Research Group. So, William and I have a lot in common, and this conversation took us into some very fun places. I'm excited to share it with you. If it excites you too, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment, because this show is still hyper niche and I respond to them all. Thanks for listening. You had just said you were telling your coach that your life is a series of mistakes. And I think that the inability to get out ahead of where our present
Yeah,
is
totally.
actually something that shows up in a lot of your work that I wanted to.
Definitely, we can do that.
Yeah.
Are we starting?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. All right. I'll let you start us off however you like.
Then, yeah, just that I was telling you that it might be months before this episode comes out, that you have that option that gives you the ability to talk about things that are very far away. But it also means that when this drops, you might look back on this and be like, wow, I was so wrong about that. And that's just that playing with time. I wanted to touch on at some point you're writing on the avant-garde and on the creation of new experience classes and all of that. So there is this theme here of trying to get out ahead of ourselves, like trying to think the unthought and the unthinkable stuff that yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. And before I launch in, let me just say thanks for having me on. And it's been a true privilege to listen to your podcasts over the years. And I remember it being the sort of main track of There. And so yeah, truly a privilege to be on. As far as like the kind of avant-garde sensibility of seeing the future, looking around corners, I think it's very much what we're trying to do and a spirit that we're trying to cultivate. And it has a little bit of taking a cue from venture, from startups, from philosophy, especially the like CCRU school, and kind of putting them all together and seeing if you can build commercial scale products based on that admixture of ideas. And so just a little bit of background on that kind of collision of things. I was an academic before doing Restless Egg, and the way I see us fitting into a certain academic trajectory is like you have the CCRU, where my PhD advisor, Luciana Parisi, came out of, and they're doing this experiment of can you combine rigorous high theory with cutting edge technological developments, namely cybernetics? And I think they basically proved that you could successfully do that. And then you get a number of things that follow in its wake of experiments trying to put that into practice. So I would say that Strelka and On to Get There are two examples of that, but there's a host of other ones, and they're innumerable. But I think that Restless Egg follows in that trajectory. If, like, for example, On to Get There was kind of like, can we use that combination of philosophy and technology to build prototypes and develop plans in the form of those video essays that we did and design briefs? Then the question of Restless Egg is, can you go one step further and actually build companies, successful, scalable companies and commercial products based on that same collision? And so to get back to your question, the like avant-garde spirit, it's not just about forecasting or projecting. It is about capturing something that's outside And this really comes into the taste conversation that's been like, maybe at this point it will have died when this episode comes out, but it'll probably be with us in some sort of zombified form. But the way you might think about taste is as a faculty of judgment that's been refined through a course of mature experience. So that someone has, through the course of their life, their work, their career, their personal experience, developed a habit of being able to render judgment on something. And so that you are able to trust it when they say this thing is going to be cool or not cool or whatever. They know something about it before it actually happens. That's what it means to have taste, is the ability to select from like a host of options what will happen. And so when we talk about taste, it's not just about like having versus not having, right? You don't need taste if I have a car and you don't, right? Taste is irrelevant because I simply have the thing. But if we both have cars, it's quite a bit more relevant that I have a Ferrari. But the way that that comes about is through some sort of abundance. That means we need to select from the abundance, and we need a kind of development of a faculty that allows us to select. And so our whole thesis about the artist founder is looking for people who have spent their entire lives basically developing that faculty. And then the thesis is that those people at the present moment have the exact skill set that's necessary and that's at an increasing premium. So people who have spent years identifying what in human relations or human technical relations really stands out, like what do people want to participate in? When you get the e-commerce revolution, the question isn't like what are the human relations, what's the friction that we want to preserve? It's exactly the opposite. But now that that SaaS revolution has happened, and we're in the agentic revolution, the question is increasingly, what are the forms of friction that we want to preserve, and what are the new economic categories that will be created around them? So this class of person has always been someone who identifies the highest value friction.
I want to back up just a little bit.
Sure.
Because we definitely hit the ground like Sonic the Hedgehog. This idea that you unpacked in your piece on taste and AI as a luxury technology, I liked how the way that you said, I do not mean luxury in the sense of premium branding. I mean luxury in the sense that something luxurious exceeds one's basic needs, goes beyond utility. That you're talking about these new experience classes, or you're talking about things that are actually like basic human functions. This like ritual, pleasure, spectacle, intimacy, useless beauty. You've got the Abraham Flexner, the usefulness of useless knowledge.
Totally.
This was like a founding paper, the advanced studies at Princeton. And this is a conversation I got into with philosopher Matthew David Segal, where he was trying to make the case that philosophy is intrinsically valuable, not extrinsically valuable. The useful friction that I identified there is that there are two levels, right? Play does not feel useful to a child or maybe to an adult that wishes their kid would go off and work in the mines already and get on with it. But play is useful to the species in terms of fine-tuning whatever learning cannot be transmitted through genetic inheritance, right? These things, like all of this stuff that we're calling luxury, is from another level, incredibly important, like ritual in the cohesion of human society, or in aesthetic experience as a driver for self-determination of the decision of what we want to pursue. So there's one thing. And then the other thing is that I love that the entire operation of Restless Egg is couched in this incubation metaphor. I've just been reading Andrew P. Smith's The Dimensions of Experience, where he's talking about how like evolution from the inside, and how like the first complex animals did not have a lot of competition. They were this avant-garde of multicellularity, exploring a space that was not already crowded. And so they were able to try all of these different body plans without the pressure of competition. So however we might see competition as like a persistent force in evolution, there are these transitional periods where there is no competition because we don't have the abundance of this thing. So I don't know, I'm just connecting the stuff that you're talking about here to more general principles in thinking about this stuff. And the last piece I'll say is that I like that you said, from the perspective of ordinary people, the AI build out does not feel luxurious at all. Most people's experience of AI so far is layoffs, price pressures, degraded trust, slop, and ambient social coercion. And you're calling for people to think otherwise. But one of the more interesting things to me that I've been ringing the bell about from very early on when AI was not so obviously useful
Mm.
was that productivity might be the wrong frame through which to understand this, that all of this utilitarian thinking is a byproduct of something that's extremely weird and explosively generative. And the relationship between these two things continues to be an item of perverse interest.
Mm.
So, yeah, I'd just love to hear you.
It's such a good set of
Yeah.
questions. So I think you're exactly right, and I think the sort of like avant-garde is like a really excellent example. I'll come to that in just a second, but just to give a very sort of concrete first answer, like the different use cases of AI feel like a luxury at this moment, but as you say, like they are very beneficial. Like we should really hope that we have this kind of luxurious experimentation with different forms of AI, because the current path of just the sort of agent to agent replacement of the SaaS economy is just one outcome of this fundamental technological revolution. So if you believe that artificial intelligence does have this kind of like underlying strangeness, or even if you don't, if you acknowledge that it is a fundamental technology, then you can imagine all of these different use cases. So we can think about other fundamental technologies, like if you want to say electricity, airplanes, the train. Like with the airplane, you not only get flight as this fundamental technology, you also get shipping, you get transcontinental travel, you get skydiving, you get all of these different things, right? And we're essentially just doubling down on one outcome from artificial intelligence. And so, as a society, at the most general level, we really do want people at this moment to be experimenting in a like broad horizontal sense with the different use cases of AI, whether that's like new forms of experience that might not be productive in themselves. They're quite societally productive because they ask what this technology means, and like it allows people to sort of actually have a democratic say over what artificial intelligence looks like. Like right now, there isn't much democracy of AI in terms of use cases. Well, in terms of much at all. But there's certainly not a democracy of AI in terms of the use cases that it's being developed for. Now, imagine a different future where there's a proliferation of, let's say, startups and products that offer you new experiences through AI that aren't like agentics for X business, Y business, that sort of thing, but are more like, here we're leveraging AI for a new type of musical experience, or we're deploying it in like a new type of robotic intimacy or for entertainment or something like this. This basically allows a kind of democratic luxury of people to decide what they want the AI future to look like. And so to go back to your multicellular example, I think that's exactly like it's almost a one-to-one map, is that like we are sort of developing these societal technical appendages, and it's like we have to explore the morphospace of what we could constitute it as. The problem that I see, and what I think the sort of traditional venture environment is missing, and that which I wrote about in that piece, is that so much funding and so much founder energy is going to this machine economy, the sort of after the SaaS apocalypse, here's how we retrofit these businesses for the agent to agent economy. That's fine. That is certainly one use case. And I don't mean to cast doubt on a productivity revolution that I think is certainly in the offing. That's not the point. The point is to develop these other use cases to provide a sort of, as I say, democratic optionality, but it is a luxury to even experiment with those, right? So the point is that we're doing luxurious experimentation. The technologies are themselves luxurious, and it should feel like a luxury in the sense that these are different ways of doing life that we are experimenting with, which we then have a choice of which way we want to grow into. Like I think the idea that the AI future is set in stone as this agent to agent economy or is determined is totally wrong. I think this is what some of the like singularity P doom discussion misses out on, is that it's not a binary yes no future. The future has so many different shapes and contours to it, and we only get to explore those by in the present developing all of these different options.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading the piece on Restless Egg at Dazed Digital, and there's a point in there where you say, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here because I think we do need to establish a little bit more in the work on the avant-garde and the role of the avant-garde in this. But regardless, it's on my mind. You say at some point that though some people might find it strange, encouraging this in the form of venture backed, scalable startups, some people might, however Days put it, they might feel like the bile come up in hearing this, that you're holding out some hope. This might model another way of thinking for Silicon Valley, or as you put it in your piece on Do AI Products Need an Avant-Garde, rather than slouching towards a future of ubiquitous intelligence interaction that is designed from and germinated within the incentive structure of the present, a future that is worthy of the name is genuinely different from the present rather than a repetition of the same only in a different moment of time. And so like Restless Egg is not just about incubating these projects that want to do this, but is itself that kind of a project that is trying to explore more of the morphospace of the way that we think about technology and business itself. It's funny because in arguing for the necessity at this moment of an avant-garde, you compare it to when the term first emerges. It arose alongside the Industrial Revolution. I mean, this piece is actually quite eloquent. You mention the work of art as material object exists to make the kernel of what the avant-gardist perceives communicable. It gives their vision form around which thought can gather and communication can begin. And then also that it makes foreseen futures legible for the first time. And you cite René Dumal's Mount Analog, the door to the invisible must be visible. In these moments, and I know I'm like hammering on this point, but the utility is actually in exploration. So like I've been thinking about this a lot with when everything becomes training data and software has already eaten the world, and therefore all of the industrially legible human labor can be reproduced at diminishing marginal cost, then it shifts to an economic regime where the real high value contributions are not whatever is standardized to the factory floor, but whatever hasn't been already, right? And so like over the last few decades, we can feel this shift from like secondary education readying people for a stable workforce to more, like colleges preparing people for entrepreneurship or teaching people how to ready themselves for lifelong learning. And so when we talk about, there's a risk in when we talk about like the production of new experiences, there's like a residue of this that is still thinking of it in terms of the experience economy, like the way that we can make all of this stuff compatible with like consumer lifestyle capitalism in service of the self-actualization of consumers and industrial institutions. But the tendency that I think you and I both see here is the weight is like shifting to the other foot, where we are being called to explore this space so strongly, in part because, again, like if we want to get into like multicellularity, this analogy I find is really deep, that a bacterial cell, 99% of its genome is producing proteins, and only 1% of it is a reservoir of adaptive potential or is involved in regulatory functions. But 99% of your genome and mine is junk DNA that is involved in like the regulation, the maintenance, and basically creating optionality for a cell. We see the same thing in that transition where it's like the part of the cell that is preoccupied with productivity is extremely concentrated in a very small region of its genome, and everything else is engaged in what you might call sense making. So yeah, that's a huge like ball of stuff. But I'm curious where you take that.
Yeah, I'll pick a couple of key bits and then feel free to steer me into the directions that you like. The first bit about sense organs, I think this is absolutely crucial. So this comes a little bit from my philosophical background studying cybernetics. And I think the person I'm thinking about here most closely is Carl Deutsch, the political scientist, first cybernetic political scientist who wrote this book. I think it was in like 69 called The Nerves of Government, where he was like, can you do political science in a cybernetic lens? And he asked this question and thought, what are the sense organs of a body politic? If you think of the like Hobbesian diagram of the Leviathan made up of all these people, like quite literally, what are computationally inflected sovereign sense organs, like in an informatic sense? And so he comes up with this really in-depth like understanding of how a political organism takes in information and reads it. And he basically says that you can measure a given polity's openness or closure to new information, and then you can determine how much it can change its orientation or positioning based on how open or closed it is at a given moment. So this is really interesting to me because the executive functioning that allows a society to steer itself can be closed out. So he gives this really cool example about how Soviet chess prodigies were taught. And he says that if these guys ever sensed that they were losing in a game of chess, the goal might not always be to develop some sort of come from behind victory strategy, but that oftentimes a better tactic to employ would be to attack their enemy's communication system and sort of almost move randomly so that the opponent doesn't know what's happening. And the idea is exactly this, that you're trying to frustrate the ability of the other player to explore the space or have their communication system open to explore the space. I would say that this is actually not totally dissimilar to what is happening now with AI and the current conversation that's happening around it. Like, I think the sort of executive decision making about what AI investments are being made, both by venture, by what's happening at the level of geopolitical conversation, by the center of gravity of conversations that happen in and around Silicon Valley and have to do with X risk, for example. But in general, the way that the conversation is unfolding, it's almost like our communication systems are under threat. And so they're quite closed to free exploration to develop these things. And so I really like the way that you said it, we're called to explore the space. That's really nice. And I kind of like the semi-theological kind of inflection that you give it. And I think it's right, especially because if we say that we are in a moment of conversational closure or politico-economic closure about what AI could be, it's why, despite everybody being like, we have this fundamental technology, things still appear to be relatively the same. Like, this is actually kind of a thing that strikes me personally is you hear these pronouncements of how everything is so different about these technologies. And it's like, yes, and my day-to-day life remains relatively similar. That to me is always like a little bit weird. And it goes back to something you referenced, the Andreessen software eats the world bit, and the like debate with Peter Thiel, the famous or infamous debate about the like atoms versus bits. And you'll remember that Andreessen is on the side of bits, the software eats the world hypothesis, and Thiel is like, where is all the change at the level of atoms? Like, we've overinvested in software, but all the buildings and infrastructure are still the same. And so I think Andreessen even did a recent podcast where he was like, I've switched sides on this. Like, I think Thiel was right. I think the atoms question is fundamental. And I think that is something coming up right now, especially, something I've written about is how artificial intelligence is increasingly best thought of as an infrastructural technology, as something that will be threaded throughout the built environment. And so one of the questions is not just how does it work in terms of agentic workflows, but how do we want to access it? What is the interaction space? In what ways does it interact with our lives, and does it come into our lives? And so I think that question is very combined with the novelty question and the closure question. and how to create a kind of openness that can interrupt a kind of monoculture that exists right now. I mean, at the beginning, we were talking about how one's wiser self often looks back on their present self and is like, idiot, why did I do that? And this is like sort of a constantly repeating phenomena. I think as like a society, we may look back and be like, why did we not focus on these new domains of experience sooner? Why did we let them lag? Because I think the built environment, the physical, the infrastructural, I think they keep us from experiencing the awesome, and I mean in the like awe-inspiring sense, power of these new technologies. They become a kind of limit. And so that's part of what we're trying to do. I don't mean to say that we're necessarily like doing all hardware, but I think hardware is in again. And I think that it provides an opportunity to break the monoculture when you have these different ways of interacting with physical space, of physical reality. And I'll just say one last bit about that, which is something we touched on earlier and we're wanting to bring into the conversation, which is that there's a model of doing venture that predominates and has since Y Combinator switched from convertible notes to inventing the safe. I think it was in 2003 that they invented the safe, the simple agreement for future equity. Basically, the idea behind it was that the convertible note comes along with all of these sort of economic concerns that founders and investors need to worry about, having to do with debt and interest rates and so on and so forth. And the safe, by being an equity agreement that only converts later on, means that you don't have to worry about that. So it becomes really easy for founders and investors to make early stage deals. Okay, so we have the safe, that becomes the industry standard. And then we get the venture industry always hoping or working towards the next financing round, right? And so the idea and what's taken shape in the sort of SaaS venture world is that you're constantly raising an additional round, you're scaling, you're going for an infinite TAM, you want to capture the entire market. This is one model. And I don't mean to say that this model doesn't work. It obviously has had enormous success. But what we're talking about is these sort of new experiments that are not about changing the infinite TAM. They're about more carving open niche spaces that are part of this like subculture resistant to slop. And so, following some other VCs who have pioneered this, we're adding a shared earnings agreement. The idea is that above a certain revenue threshold and founder earnings threshold, Restless Egg gets a cut of the business's profits. And so the reason we have that is to say that traditionally, if you want to have a small or medium sized business, you're out of alignment with your venture investor because you might not be trying to raise another round. You're at loggerheads in terms of they want you to scale infinitely. You might just want to build a sustainable, successful business. We think that given the founder class that we're supporting, this kind of avant-garde niche founder who knows their audience, has like a needful audience that is like responsive to them at the level of culture. They have built distribution through their creative practices and so on and so forth. Let's say they want to build one of these businesses that's generating cash flow, that's commercially successful. We as investors want to be aligned with that and say, we don't need you to raise another round. So the shared earnings agreement says that we can be in alignment with you as you produce revenue. And we think that that's the way that we can economically support founders who want to produce this kind of impact.
So, like all of this, I'm holding it together in a superposition with this article I've been writing with my colleague Simon Quarmby at Atlas Research. He did accounting at Amazon, and he's been thinking a lot about financial innovation. And this piece is on how, over the last 200 years, despite the efforts of all of these prominent economists, we have confused profit and rent, where like rent is a permanent positional claim on something. If you go back to, for instance, Lewis Hyde's really fabulous history of intellectual property law, Common as Air, and he talks about how all of the original patent and IP stuff going all the way back to 1474, and like certainly as it was devised in the early United States, set a 14-year term exclusivity because it was considered the natural lifespan within which somebody could train two generations of apprentices before releasing the idea back into the commons. And that the understanding was that this balanced public enrichment with private opportunity, that the real innovation does not happen within an enclosure, that it has to be put out into the world at some point. And that what has happened is you see these papers by like Johann Chu and James Evans on slowed canonical innovation in the sciences. And it's like the larger a domain becomes, the more financialized it becomes in the sense that we're used to operating over the course of our lifetimes anyway, the more everyone's attention is focused in one way. So like to tie everything you said to this piece on rent and IP and like on enclosure and commonsing to the stuff we were just talking about a moment ago, like the cognitive closure of a society. I see this all as related to like model
Mm.
collapse. Like if you don't have a constant influx of new data or new experience, and you're increasingly overfit on your training, or the way that Wendell Berry puts it in Standing by Words is that there's been an imbalance between internal and external accounting, and that the more we focus on productivity, the more we lose sight of all of the community and the ecology that it's like substantiating all of this. And so I think the reason we are being called to the avant-garde is like maybe less theological than that. It's more like a Thomas Kuhn kind of like the anomaly becomes so burdensome at some point that you have to look beyond your framework,
Mm.
and that we're at this point where we are turning our attention back out. It's actually, there is this sort of like opportunistic thing still in play here where, for instance, there's enormous wealth waiting for the people who figure out how to scale the bioremediation of plastic and radiation and like these kinds of things. How do we close the metabolic loop by opening the theoretical loop that we've been stuck in? So it's just like the ecological frame Simon is working on is the positional claim on perpetual value extraction through rent is equivalent to immortalism.
Mm.
It's like the value in a particular idea is enriched by these sort of phases of exclusivity and incubation, and then the release into the commons where we're able to like leverage innovation as a collective enterprise. And that there's a cyclicity to all of this that we see in all complex adaptive living systems that we've ignored. But the last citation I'll stack on this is like Tyson Yunkaporta saying there's human law and there's the law of the land. There's the first law.
Mm.
And eventually, if human law is out of alignment with the law of the land has the final say. And so I see this idea of financial structures reward companies that are not necessarily supposed to scale as an adaptation to our increasing awareness. Ecosystems are not made entirely out of whales and elephants. Like we can actually see that the economy needs to be able to afford as many different kinds of activity as possible in order to close as many metabolic loops as possible, in order to actually do what it thinks it's doing, which is to continue to explore this morphospace and maximize entropy production, minimize available free energy. Like there's actually so much more profit and so much more creativity in us all not collapsing on this traditional approach. Anyway, yeah, there's like another 90 million things.
So it's funny because I don't normally speak about what we're doing in terms of like the sort of ecological health of a society, but I think you're exactly right that like if you limit what a technological revolution can do to like one set of use cases, it is really quite unhealthy for a society. I mean, the thinker sort of lurking behind so much of this is Bataille, who I think I referenced once in that piece, but like the famous like occur share framework is that like if you have this surplus of energy and you don't expend it, you get militaristic outcomes. And I think anybody who's gone down the Bataille rabbit hole has probably been like, I wish he could be a little bit more clear instead of the sort of like mad raving librarian that he was and sort of operating at the level of vibes, which cool. But I never thought I would come back around to Bataille for dealing with the stuff that we're dealing with right now. But I do think the sort of general economic lens to think about artificial intelligence, and that we're having this buildup in the energy going towards these productive use cases, I do think there's like a decent argument that someone could write about an inherent connection between that and the shortening of the kill chain. I mean, people are writing about that already. I won't say a ton more about that, but I will say that I think expanding the options of what artificial intelligence is for, expending energy on developing those options and giving people the ability to invest in those and become attached to those is fundamental to the health of a society. I think we're actually pretty close to starting to see that in terms of like an inflection point in slop. So I think probably 8 to 12 months from when we are recording, I think the slopification that consumers feel is probably headed towards a worse place, at least the way that they are fed content. And we may even get some of the brief tangent. There's this Neil Stevenson book called Fall. It's his like Paradise Lost retelling about consciousness upload. But in the first half of the book, he describes a nuclear bomb that goes off in Moab, only it hasn't really gone off. It's been like a sort of digital fake. And what happens as a result of it is the like truthiness of the internet fractures as a result. And so like online space just all becomes like 8chan, and there is no more internet anymore as like a source of communication. That's obviously a dramatic outcome, but I do think we're closing in on a moment where people realize that the slopification, homogenous, this is for everyone kind of tendency that we've produced in products so far is being rebelled against. Like we already see it in sort of the rise of youth subcultures and the pursuit of subcultures as a way of identifying oneself, as a way of doing individualization. So I think that more people will be talking about how the premium on frictional human relations is key. I was having a conversation with one of our founders, Flora Wheel, who does Nephilah, about this. And one of the things that she and I spoke about was this sort of tautological frame that human relations are unique to humans. So it's this idea that like I think a lot of people are threatened by the fact that artificial intelligence can do what we do. And I think that most attempts to say humans are unique because AI can't do X, Y, and Z are sort of a losing train, this kind of like receding yardstick of what human is. Like they couldn't play chess, they couldn't hold conversations, et cetera, et cetera. So I wouldn't put too much stake in that distinction. But you can make the tautological argument that human relations are fundamental to being human. And that's not at all diminished by the fact that you can also have a relationship with an AI model. And so this kind of like anomaly that you're talking about, this burdensome anomaly that becomes an imperative to think is like, okay, well, what are the ways that we can develop technologies that actually lead to what one section of the community calls human flourishing, experimentation, new use cases for AI. I think this sort of like optimistic, I mean, I wouldn't call it necessarily techno optimistic kind of pursuit because that has a whole set of baggages, but more optimistic about the future as a catalyst for change. I think if you want to invest in that, then you can ask the question of like what human makes it out of the near future. Okay, let me bracket on that and say one last thing about the rent comment that you made. And it's not exactly addressed to what you said, but I think it's related. I think that the ethos and mission of Restless Egg is to intervene at the level of sustainable financial models for this genre of person. So you and I have spoken about this before, but it's worth restating is that like the origin of Restless Egg is really in this community of people, and then realizing that the financial institutions that existed to support them were being hollowed out by external factors, were small grants that couldn't sustain them, forced them to compete against each other. And the timelines of them are really short, such that by the time you're halfway through a residency, you're already applying for the next residency. This is not to say like the art world can't produce great things. I just think that it produces great things for some people, but I think it doesn't produce great things for the whole host of people that are in it. I think that's a pretty uncontroversial statement, at least in terms of financial outcomes. And so we basically created Restless Egg as a way of supplementing the existing financial incentives for that genre of person. What our idea was, what our hypothesis was, is that the innovation that was happening in these spaces was significant, had societal level importance, and was rising in value, but that the incentive system that existed to propel these people outside of cloistered conversations was not functioning in the way that it should have. So, like previously, you might have had patronage models, you might have had government support to elevate these people who could bring in these new ideas. But if that's not functioning, and the model of scaling that exists today is that the product and the company are commensurate with the size and speed of society, and that you have an attention scarce environment, and so to affect change you do have to acknowledge some of those things, even if you don't want to do them at venture scale. You have to acknowledge those things and participate to a degree, but also innovate within them. So that's the Restless Egg ethos on that front. But last comment on this thing is that I think for us, the IP model was something we were skeptical about, in that we didn't want to enter into pitched battles with founders over who owned IP. So Restless Egg takes no IP and has no interest in owning any of the IP of the founders. The equity model for us had the advantage of borrowing that kind of alignment thinking that exists in Silicon Valley. And so I do think that there is a kind of fast innovation that is permissioned by that kind of capital infrastructure. Of course, I've said ways that I think it needs to be innovated upon, but I think bringing in these different themes, these sort of tactics for incentivizing people and developing new forms of experimentation, that's what we do. But I'll end this by saying that, like, everyone who comes through the incubator knows and is fully aware that commercial success is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition of what we're trying to do, both from the Restless Egg side of allowing this to be sustainable for other artist founders to come in, and for scaling the ideas such that the founders can go beyond the reliance on grants or external funding and can have their impact in a way that's self-sustaining.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, again, in that the piece on Dazed Digital, you speak to another thing that I've been writing about, which is that we've been given a false binary between either you participate in institutionally owned collective intelligence, or you go to the opposite extreme and you go dark. You exit from the future entirely. And in so doing, we cut off our nose to spite our face, because, like, you talk in a few of these pieces about the importance of, as Lydia Noshlein in The Politics of Vision, talking about alienation as crucial to the avant-garde, that similarly Damian Walter talks about cognitive estrangement as a feature of science fiction, that, like, you're creating, as a science fiction author, a novum that acts as like a seed crystal, like one variable you want to change that makes the world a very different place, and then the world builds around that change. You can feel that in what Noshlein is saying about the alienation of the avant-garde, that, like, knowing that something can be different is what inspires that kind of curiosity. Again, it's the call or whatever. But a lot of people are responding to the cognitive estrangement of the world that's being given to them. As you say, someone has either designed the future for us, or it's outside of our reach, or it's too grandiose or ineffable to even begin to describe. And the response is to shrink away and not to participate in that. And so where I see this thing, like, well, it has to be viable, this injunction to make these projects commercially viable, I see as related to this third way that is not like just give all of your data to the big tech companies, or refuse to participate in the commons governed collective intelligence that is possible if we had the architecture for it, right? That it's like, if you really want to navigate these futures, we're going to have to develop the affordances to engage in sovereign collective intelligence. And so, like, these two issues are very tightly related to me.
So I think the point that I would make is that we actually are not yet in a place where we can have a sovereign decision, because the only decision seemingly available is refuse or let it rip. And so that's the closure I'm talking about. And I think we're agreeing on this. And it's what we're all sort of sensing, so that you have this forced choice of like, I'm in or I'm out. And that kind of feels horrible. And so, in order to develop the capacities to have this sovereign choice over what future one wants to inhabit, we do need the development of different sensory capacities that give us more options. I think it's right to say that probably the only choice right now is like, are you in or are you out? Because that's the only choice we've been afforded. And so part of the Restless Egg mission is to try and break the stranglehold on this. So from where we are, we're doing that kind of cognitive estrangement on the financial side. But I think this puts us into a sort of nice relationship with the founders, because I hope that they can see that we're embodying the same estrangement that they are themselves doing, especially in running the accelerator, not just the traditional venture like investing side of things. But so maybe I use this opportunity to speak a little bit about some of the founders and what they're developing in terms of alternatives to the refuse or let it rip. And maybe just before I do, I can say that like this is exactly what I mean when I talk about luxury technology. And the current batch is that right now it's refuse or let it rip. But the idea of a luxury technology is the luxury of choice. And so to open that decision calculus to more than these two options. So, a couple of examples. Self Engineering, founded by Jack Self, is developing a new information hygiene. Well, I don't think he would call it that. I think he would say it is a cultural intelligence engine. But in this discourse that you and I are having, which is more philosophical, I would say that what he is doing is thinking of a informational hygiene relationship to the feed, and how the feed represents my point of view or what the algorithm says my point of view ought to be. But it really constrains that to my point of view. Like, always scroll the feed as myself. That's very strange. What if you scrolled from a different perspective? That is a different kind of sense organ that is like, can I participate in the sensory affordances of, let's say, as a first instance, someone else's algorithm? Obviously, that has much broader implications. There's these two Berlin-based artists who I'm always fond of bringing up in conversations about exactly this, called Brad and Salvador, developing Lovebot, which is the new robotic intimacy project that's developed specifically through sex tech products. Super cool, super interesting idea. And I think what they offer is that the relationship between AI and intimacy isn't like love it or hate it. It's much more flexible. And I think that has enormous implications for how we think about robotics entering our spaces. And I think that we will need those conversations rather than just it's the humanoid assistant or the like smart home Disney house that wants to kill you. I think you and I have spoken about this before, but if not, we've certainly had separate conversations about it, about how the sci-fi imaginaries that we had from the golden age need to be replenished. And it's easy to say that, but you also need some like fundamental innovation to replenish those. So in a lot of ways, I think that what we're doing is part of that feedback cycle of allowing new imaginations and new technologies to be developed on top of them. I mean, the sort of most lizard-brained example of this in the portfolio is robot dog fighting. So yeah, I mean that one tends to stand out and grab people's attention for obvious reasons. Really cool group of founders, Ben, Edwin, and Sharna. Their thinking is like, what is combat sport for the AI era? What is the new relationship that AI promises for entertainment? And what I think is maybe the more philosophical aspect, I'm not asking them to forward this kind of thinking, but if we're adopting that battalion framework of the accursed share, right now you've got all this defense tech energy that's happening in Silicon Valley, and it's like, you build all those weapons, they don't just sit on the shelf. But if we could have this kind of new entertainment product, it's a much better outcome for where those things go than being used against people. I can go on about all the different founders. I mean, I'd love to champion all of them.
That's the origin of sport, right? It's like, we've got to do something with all of this energy so that we don't just go to war. And that gets back to the evolutionary utility of play. But I actually do, because you mentioned sex tech founders exploring robots entering our spaces, which I thought was hilariously on the nose. I want to end here because, at least ostensibly, this show is helping people do the avant-garde thing and estrange themselves in good ways, right? So you asked this question about why does everything in the near future either want to kill you or get you off, that I thought was brilliantly parsimonious. And I just want to say, this is your chance, I guess, to speculate what all of this that we're talking about now do you think is going to open up for us? Like, what do you actually see and what do you actually want in the future? What does that world actually feel like and look like? And I'll just to give you a prompt to go off of. I've been hinting at this for the entire conversation, that I think that we can look at the last 100 years or so as a world where the most luxurious thing is to engage in the pursuit of self-actualization, and everyone else is just trying to get by. And that maybe what the next economy offers is that self-actualization is actually like the low rung, but that the economic pressure is on self-transformation, on continual learning, on discovery, that it turns out that the lowest rungs of the economy are going to be the people that consider themselves like fixed, that there is an essential or authentic self to satisfy. And, we can already see this. It's like if you have a legible job category you're searching for on LinkedIn, by the time you find it, there's already 100 people who have applied. And like those islands are drying up. And it feels like the movement of history is into a world where people are freed from having to settle into something legible, because again, the real value is in contextually assisted mass parallel search of an expanding adjacency. So like that vibe is going to be scary to a lot of people because it means you don't get to rest on your laurels. But it's going to be exciting for a lot of people who felt like they were never able to bring their full self to work. So that kind of stuff I'd love to hear you riff on for the last few minutes.
Yeah, I think I might disappoint you. And the reason is that I could say some things about like cybernetic human enhancement and new forms of governance and like the atoms looking different and all of these kind of like sci-fi imaginaries or whatever we might call them, like bringing those into more reality. And I sort of feel these days that that is the job of a past version of myself. That would have been what my academic self would have wanted to do and loved to do. And now, when you say, what do I want? I have a much clearer answer that actually feels a lot better. So, what do I want to see in the future? I want to have this community of potential artist founders, people who consider themselves avant garde creators or thinkers or experimenters, have more opportunities to attain the kind of funding that will allow them to begin, scale, fully pursue their self-estrangement in our case, in the form of products. My job mission now is to be an opener of doors for that kind of person and to try and build an institution that facilitates that. So in that, I think my sort of academic responsibility is to develop questions. And so the luxury technology point, I think of as a question. I have some answers, but my best answers are here's what the founders are working on. And it's like I'm developing a question and a format for helping them to develop answers. And so I think the hope is more experiments, more products, more options, healthier society. But I can tell you, like, maybe the healthier society is sort of down the road. I go back to that conversation I was referencing with Flora, and something she said to me that really stuck out was that it's not possible to experience the true joy of freedom alone. And I was kind of like, oh, damn, that's powerful. And I had to think about that for a while. And it rings true with a lot of what we've been doing at Restless Egg and what Restless Egg is about. Because for me, a big problem that I ended up having with the academy was that it felt like oftentimes, who was I doing it for? If somebody was driving home and their car broke down, nobody was calling me being like, hey, my car broke down. Can you give me a quick lecture on cybernetics? And it felt badly to not be of service to anyone. And so I think that the point of Restless Egg is like to leave the community of people better than we found it, and to sort of bet on that the unique thing to humans is human relationality. And so I'll just say that the last bit, if you've read the newsletter, you see that I'm obsessed with this Brian Eno term, genius.
It's the
It's the
best.
best. It's so good and so simple. But if you haven't come across it, genius just means the genius of the collective rather than the individual genius who emerges from it. And so if there's a kind of what do I want final word, it would be like, do it for the genius.
Honestly, I think your best future and my best future are the same thing. I'm talking about maybe the what it looks like at one level, and you're talking about how it actually happens and your place in the underlying mechanism. Once again, we vibe hard every time we speak, and thank you for taking the time to do this. But more importantly, thank you for being the kind of person who wants this future.
I appreciate it. And I think what I would say to that is that I'm not sure it's some sort of like inbuilt thing. I feel that I have been given a great privilege of being around these incredible people. And that has allowed me to like find a lane and lean into it. So, I mean, if there's one sort of piece of advice amidst the like oncoming AI wave, it's that the Silicon Valley people like to talk about broadening the surface area of experience increases your amount of luck. I would say in the specific domain of like human relation, broadening the surface area of that and like doing cool experiments with people and just like continuing to like part of being avant-garde in the like least elitist way is that anybody can try to be avant-garde. And it's kind of like if you say you're trying to be avant-garde, you are. So I would encourage anyone who is considering the artist founder pathway or even looking for a way into this. It's like double down on the human relation side, see what's frictiony in there, where like creativity, taste, culture, whatever spark, and where you feel them brushing up against estrangement, then follow that.
Yeah, which means, I guess, thanks for listening, but this is a parasocial relationship. Go find the real people that you can be weird with right now and run more experiments.
Hell yeah,
with
brother.
them. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks again for listening. Humans on the Loop is a labor of love. If you want more of this in the world, consider becoming a member at michaelgarfield.substack.com. Like new and beloved patrons Yul Mackey, Ron Walco, Moses Silberger, Marcus Barrick, and Chris Walker. You can also support the show with tax-deductible donations at every.org/humansontheloop, and then maybe I can finally hire an editor to spend more time on writing and research. More writing and conversations are on the way, including the first in a series of extremely heady dialogues with my friend, cognitive neuroscientist Adam Safran of Tufts University on the current state of scientific exploration into world models, human, machine, and otherwise. Until then, stay tuned and remember the words of René Dumont: the door to the invisible must be visible.